but it's not. Really, no matter what the cause is in the stem of the plant. Hello, welcome back to Sage and Stone Homestead. My name is Heather. It's a rainy day. You can probably hear the rain on the greenhouse. It's definitely picking up right now. And it's days like this where I'm really grateful that I have a space like this to work. There are a couple things that I need to do in the greenhouse today, and I wanted to chat with you guys a little bit about how to deal with pests and disease in the garden. So a lot of pests and disease can be very, very regional. I know there are a lot of places that deal with things like squash bugs and squash vine borers, and there are places that I've never heard of such a thing. For a little bit of context, I am gardening in southwestern Kentucky, Zone 7B. I think it's technically the South. We do deal with a lot of heat, a lot of humidity, and we also happen to live right in the middle of big agriculture farmland. So there are acres and acres of corn across the street from us. Up the street there are acres and acres of soy, where there is a lot of synthetic pesticide and synthetic fertilizers and herbicides and things spread all around us, and we don't do that here. We try to farm as organically as possible. You will see me using non-organic fertilizers sometimes, and you will see me using things like Miracle Grow Soil, which has non-organic fertilizers and things in it. I think sometimes even in doing things with organic products, we can inadvertently mess up the natural balance of things, and sometimes we end up killing a non-target species that actually could benefit us in the garden. So I have sprayed a little bit of BT and used a little bit of BT, that is Bacillus thuringiensis, on my garden this year. And that's really about it. I've done a tiny bit of DE, which is diatomaceous earth, but really I haven't broadcast whole huge bunches of that. In general, with things like bugs, it's important to keep on top of disease, because usually healthy plants don't attract bugs. It's the sick and diseased and plants that are kind of suffering that you'll notice are kind of a bug magnet. A little earlier in the year, I did have a plant over here. It was a delicata, and it was just kind of sick looking from the beginning. I ended up pulling it out because it did have a lot of squash bugs on it, and it seems like those squash bugs really haven't transferred over to this nice healthy plant here. Which, look, it's not a watermelon. That is a giant round zucchini. It even has one of those little sunspots like a watermelon, but it's not. I have picked a couple of these that are kind of big, and they're actually still really good this large. What you can do is actually just cut them in half like this, a lot like you would a spaghetti squash, and roast it like a spaghetti squash, and then stuff it and use it like a bowl. Super yummy. I'm gonna probably do that this week. Anywho, back to the pests. So that particular plant that I had pulled out was pretty pest ridden because I think it had been dealing with some disease. And I don't really know what spurred on that disease. At first I thought that the little powdery parts of the leaves may have been just how the leaves grow, because I've got an example over here too. Sometimes a powdery substance on leaves is just part of how the plant is. Now this isn't exactly powdery, but you can see this lovely coloration. This appears to be part of this plant. I think that this is a bush style sugaretti. Here's an example down here. Now this plant dealt with a lot of wind pressure yesterday, so it has blown over. This plant really isn't sick. There's a few squash bug eggs right here. So in our last garden tour, I got a lot of comments about how beautiful and lush and healthy the garden looks. And that's not without work. I really appreciate everybody noticing. But don't forget that I have the control of where to show in the garden with my camera. I have the control of editing. And I don't often take you guys along on kind of my cleanup process and what I do to make the garden look good. So as I mentioned, I think a lot of pest pressure comes from a diseased plant. So if I can kind of start at the source there and focus more on disease than on the pests, I think that that's the best thing to do. So I've got these little shears here, and my favorite thing to do rather than spray anything for disease on my plants is literally just to cut the disease away. There are a couple different organic controls that you can use for different diseases diseases. One of the main diseases that we deal with here is called powdery mildew. And one of the ways that I have tried to combat this year is just growing plants that are resistant to powdery mildew. A hybrid plant is not a GMO plant. So don't think that just because you're growing hybrids, it means that you're growing something that's genetically modified. You're not, like, not really. What you're growing is just a cross between two plants. And there's really nothing wrong with that. And you can get what's called hybrid vigor, which makes these plants inherently more healthy. And if you live in a place like ours, it's really hot and humid, it can be a lot less work to grow plants like that. You spend a lot less time trying to keep them healthy, and subsequently a lot less time trying to keep the bugs off of them. I think some of these squash plants that I'm growing are powdery mildew resistant plants, but these beans over here, these are not. These are black-eyed peas. They're an heirloom variety, and we do have a little bit of rust going on down here. So we've talked about powdery mildew, and I may have an example of that to show you out on the lane. That's more of like a fungal thing. A lot of cucumbers and beans and things will have viruses. There's a really common virus called mosaic virus, and that may be what these beans are dealing with here. It also could be blight, and blight is bacterial. You usually see these kinds of spots and things with blight. And right next to it here is a bush bean plant with a little bit of rust on it. And really, no matter what the cause is, these leaves are sick. And in order to combat the sickness, you could spray on something to try and help slow the spread down. Something like neem oil is a good choice. But really, I think the best thing to do is to just remove those leaves. And if you have an entire sick plant, just remove those plants. And if you're not sure about what you're dealing with, it's a good idea just to burn the plants. You don't want to be putting that in like a compost pile, because unless you're really good at composting and you know you're going to get your compost pile up to a temperature that's going to kill these viruses and bacteria, you could easily end up putting that compost on your garden again next year and kind of seeding that area with those bacteria and viruses that harm your plant. So just totally get rid of these unless you're real good at composting. I am not. When you spray something like that on the plants, you can help protect some of the leaves that are not affected, but you're not going to be able to heal the plants or the leaves that are already affected. So I like to remove these leaves because there's really no sense in the plant putting its energy into trying to support these leaves, because these leaves are not able to give back to the plant the same amount of energy. They're costing the plant more to hang on to, so I just get rid of them. It is good practice too to use clean shears and to not use these to like harvest something from a healthy plant. That would just be kind of transferring the disease to the healthy plant, and you don't want to do that. So right now I'm really not focusing on harvesting, and when I do, I'm going to go ahead and wash my hands and then come back and do that, because I'm touching a lot of disease dealing with these plants today. So I am talking a little bit about how to deal with disease when you see it, but it's also a good idea to consider prevention of certain diseases. And many diseases are spread in hot and humid environments. They're spread by moisture. So over here in the greenhouse, it's raining right now, but the leaves of these plants are not getting wet, and that's really helpful for these guys. If they were getting this rain on them, this disease would very easily spread with that water, and that would be no good. Generally what you see is disease starting on the bottom of the plants where they're more in contact with the soil, and then the disease kind of starts to spread upward. We're seeing a little bit of that here since our disease leaves are closer towards the bottom. I do have bottom watering here in the greenhouse, and that's a very good idea. It's a very good method in order to keep disease as minimal as possible. Also, growing on a trellis like this can really help increase airflow in the leaves. You can see that there are quite a few plants here. They are kind of packed in, but there's also quite a lot of airflow, and that helps keep the plants healthy. And by trimming out these diseased leaves too, that also is going to help increase the airflow. As you can see here, there's a lot fewer of the diseased leaves left in there, and as a consequence, there's a lot more airflow down at the bottom. And it's important to keep in mind too that what we're doing here is fighting a losing battle. We are not going to win the battle against disease. Taking off the diseased leaves, even treating them with maybe even something chemical, is not going to win the battle. Ultimately, what we're doing here is just slowing down the disease so these plants can stay alive long enough to provide us with food. See, I'm not going to get every single leaf, but every little bit counts. And I probably do this about twice a week. Truthfully, I'm in here and in the lane and in the raised bed garden several times a day. And I try to not just enter the garden in order to reap something from it. I try to keep in the mindset of, if I want something out of the garden, I have to give back to it. I have a general rule of thumb that when I enter any garden space, I need to either pick 3 leaves or deal with like 3 points of disease. So we did more than that today. There's definitely something to be said too, if your growing season is long enough, of planting your maybe more susceptible plants, like for us it's squash, planting them at a time when maybe the pest pressure traditionally is less intense. So as far as this big old scallop squash here, I actually started these seeds inside the greenhouse here before our estimated last frost date. These plants were able to get big enough and stay robust enough so when the time came for the pests to really find them, they were strong enough to withstand at least a little bit of pest pressure. So maybe historically you have real bad squash bugs and squash vine borers in the fall. It might be better for you to try to grow squash in the springtime, and you can start squash seeds inside. So let's say your last estimated frost isn't until the end of April. You could start your seeds indoors in the beginning of April, and as long as you don't let them get bigger than about 3 weeks big, if that makes sense. If you take them out longer than about 3 weeks, they're going to be really outgrowing their pot. But even that 3 weeks can give you a real big jump on the season and hopefully a big jump on the pests. So truthfully for me, with these 2 plants here, they have more than earned their keep. I'm still trying to keep them alive and whatever. I'm just not breaking my back in order to do so. We've gotten more than I expected off of these plants, way more. See those squash bugs? Right here. So you know how I mentioned before, taking out a plant that just appears to be losing the fight, like more so than the others. I think that this is a plant that I'd like to remove. I don't actually see much as far as production on this plant at all. It's spending all of its energy in dealing with whatever disease that it's dealing with. It's starting to kind of pass it on to the plants neighboring it. Most of the plants here in this row look pretty healthy. This guy, this is a prime candidate for removal. It looks like it's had to deal with a little bit of squash vine borer, and this is absolutely a loss. So we're over here by the burn pit, and this plant has a lot of squash vine borer activity on it, and I haven't had a chance to really show you much of that this year, but this is one of the main pests that we deal with this time of year. Okay, here we go. See this kind of mealy, like sawdusty looking stuff here? This is called frass, and this essentially is what the squash vine borer like casts to the side as it literally bores into the plant. And as I broke this plant apart, I actually saw the borer, so we're gonna dig it out. I'm gonna see if we can get this to focus, but there's this little like whitish clear critter inside the plant with a black head. That is a squash vine borer. They are put there by their mother, who is a squash vine borer moth, and it's their favorite thing to destroy squash plants. So if you catch this early enough, while the plant really hasn't suffered too much, you can actually take like a clean scalpel and cut where you see this frass, find the little bugger and dig them out, and you have a chance of saving your plant from that. This plant was too sick, too far gone, really wasn't worth trying to recuperate. We weren't going to get anything out of it to really equal our efforts into that. But it's something that I have done before. And another thing that I've done before that a viewer actually reminded me to do is you can get liquid BT. Well, BT again is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's actually a bacteria that when ingested by the larval form of really any insect, it just stops their digestive process. They don't eat anymore. When you don't eat, you die. And it takes care of them really well. So this viewer reminded me that I could take the liquid form and take like a hypodermic needle and just inject it into the hollow stems of my squash. And I actually did that in some of my squash in the greenhouse and all of the squash in the lane, and those guys are super healthy, so it really might be working. There's quite a few different points on this plant where I think there's quite a few borers in here, but I can hear the rain coming back, so we gotta get back in the greenhouse. Remember that it's kind of a losing battle. You just do what you can in order to get your harvest. And you really shouldn't try to sweat too hard to keep any one plant alive. You have to really assess, is this worth doing? So this huge squash that's been here for months and is still trying to crank out squash, I can tell that it is starting to get a little bit of bug pressure and it will be ending its life relatively soon. And we have some replacements over here that really need to have more of my attention. As I mentioned, we got a lot out of this plant and I probably will be removing it relatively soon. I'd rather remove it and burn those leaves than allow those bugs to really breed and proliferate in this space. So I know my time is limited in this space. Instead of spending all of my time focusing on this older plant that really has its days numbered anyway, I'm gonna make sure that these guys are okay. So I'm looking at the stem here, making sure we don't have any signs of squash vine borer. Everything looks really healthy in here. Just gonna take out the few fallen leaves that I see. I'll remove this spent blossom too. This plant I actually had dug in here a couple days ago to try and dig out a squash vine borer that did get in the plant. You can see it's got a pretty decent wound here. There's another one. Usually the squash vine borers will lay their eggs along the base of the vine, and that's where they can do the most damage. But sometimes you'll see the frass on one of the leaves, and there's definitely, it's kind of small, it's probably impossible to see, but there's a little squash vine borer right here in the leaf. And there's actually one in the stem of the plant as well, another one in a different spot. So I did dig it out. There's quite a big hole in the plant, so hopefully it will survive. If not, it's just kind of par for the course this time of year. I think I'm realizing that the earlier in the year that I can plant our squash, the better chance I have of getting a harvest. Truthfully too, when it comes to pests and disease in the garden, there are good years and there are bad years. I think that one of the reasons that this has been a pretty good year for us as far as bugs go is we had a really hard freeze that I think a lot of us had in the United States this winter, and a lot of southern bugs are not used to experiencing that. They're not used to, overwintering underground with that kind of temperature pressure. So I think it really did help alleviate the bugs that we're dealing with this year and possibly into next year. Last year, we had a really extreme drought in this area, and my raised bed garden, I mean, it produced, but it didn't produce half as well as it's producing this year. And you can water and water and water with your hose, but sometimes if you don't get rain, the plants just don't do as well. So try to cut yourself some slack as a gardener. Some things are genuinely out of your control. Just try to always remember that when you enter the garden, you can't just continually take from it. You need to think about different ways that you can give back.